give some highlights to this morning for the next hour and a half. Really what I'm going to be going over when it comes to human trafficking is what it is. And I think you may have been exposed to this subject matter, maybe through another training or seeing something on the news, but I'm going to give you the legal definition of what human trafficking is, give information about how to identify potential survivors, either people that are currently being exploited or some of those exploited in the past, and then lastly, give information about programs that are available to assist. And when I say assist, I don't only mean survivors of human trafficking, but to assist you. My expectation is not by the end of my training this morning that you all are experts in this field and know everything about human trafficking, but hopefully you'll have a basic understanding about this subject matter, and hopefully you'll remember that there are programs available to assist you as a professional. So when you start to engage with someone and you're not sure what to say or to do or what programs are available, you know there are agencies and programs that are there to support you as you support that individual. So with that said, let's dive into the PowerPoint presentation. And again, hopefully through this presentation, if you have any questions, please let me know.
You're muted.
There we go. Able to be heard again? Great. I was just sharing that this information is a little emotional. If you yourself are a survivor of a violent crime, or if you have a loved one that was, just hearing this information may stir up some feelings and emotions for you. And I want to acknowledge that. So please take care of yourself, both throughout this training and the rest of the day. I don't have any graphic pictures or graphic stories, but again, just hearing this information may stir up some feelings. Also, I really encourage folks throughout the training to ask questions. I will pause periodically through the training to elicit questions, but as I'm going along, and if something's not clear to you, please feel free to unmute yourself. Generally speaking, I'm not able to see the chat, so if you do have a question, just simply unmute yourself and say, hey, Raj, what do you mean by that, or can you clarify? And then lastly, really what I'd like to do is make this a space that's a place for you to learn new skills that will help you identify survivors and get them connected to services. I want to express to you the last little caveat this morning in full disclosure is periodically through the presentation, I am going to use a little bit of humor. And the reason I do that, it's not because this is obviously a funny subject matter, but just to lighten the mood a little bit and to make my presentation a little bit more memorable, I will sprinkle a few jokes and anecdotes throughout the presentation. So hopefully no one is offended by that and sees it in a positive way that it was intended. So with that, I'd like to transition to actually talking about this subject matter and talking first about our agency. A lot of folks on the Zoom meeting today may not be familiar with the IRC. And just to give you a little bit of background, we are a nonprofit organization that's been around since 1933. Real briefly, prior to the lead up of the World War II, back in 33, Albert Einstein saw that a lot of individuals and families were being harmed and actually killed. And Albert went to several European leaders and said something needs to be done. Unfortunately, government agencies weren't doing their role, and there weren't nonprofits back in the day. So luckily, those leaders listened to Albert, and the IRC was formed. A few years later, the United States became a part of that collaborative. And now we're an agency that's very similar to the Red Cross or other nonprofits that when individuals and families are in a place of harm, we're one of those agencies that go in and provide a place of hope to transition those people to other communities and other areas within their communities and also to other countries. We have offices around the world. We have offices that are providing services. Primarily, we are a refugee resettlement organization. And the office that I am in here in the United States is in Sacramento. So we're relatively close. And when and if you're ever in our neck of the woods and you would like to have a tour of our facility or meet some of the staff that's doing some of this awesome work, I'd love to facilitate that. Also, too, we've been providing those services as far as refugee resettlement since 1986 in the Sacramento office. Also, for the last 7 years, we've been providing services to human trafficking survivors. So the focus of my presentation today is going to be largely based on our experience of working with survivors and passing on some lessons learned, both from our work and from the experiences of the clients we've worked with. We've roughly worked with around 400 individuals over the last 7 years. And right now we have currently a caseload of about 35 to 40 individuals that we're currently working with. As far as my background, hopefully this is a safe place to disclose. I've actually worked in the social service field for about 26 years. For about 19 years, I worked at a local domestic violence and sexual assault center where I did everything from working with clients in our legal department, working in the front office, being a supervisor of various programs. Everything a person could do at a deviant SA center other than working at a shelter, I did. Then for about 4 years, I worked at UC Davis, both at the college campus and at the hospital in Sacramento, where I was both an educator and an advocate. So I've actually had the experience of working with clients. And just recently, in June of this year, I celebrated my 5-year anniversary at the IRC, where currently my title is the Anti-Human Trafficking Outreach and Training Specialist. So though I don't see clients directly now, I have the privilege of going out to the community, providing free trainings about this subject matter and encouraging collaborations with our agency and our program. So that's a little bit about me and a little bit about the agency that I currently work for. The first part of my presentation, I want to go over what the definition of human trafficking is, give you information about how to identify survivors, and then lastly, finish on a positive note, talking about how to assist. And again, not just to assist survivors of this crime, but to assist you as a professional. So let's talk about the definition. Let's get that foundation settled. I want to be clear, this definition is not my definition. The definition I'm about to share is not the IRC's, but it's actually the federal government. Sadly, the exploitation of human beings is not something that's new to my or your generation, that people have been exploited for millennia. Even here in the United States, people were being exploited and taken advantage of. But prior to 2000, law enforcement were doing their part, nonprofits were doing theirs, but we weren't all on the same page. So back in 2000, when we had a functioning federal government, largely based on work done by the United Nations, the US government came up with a working definition and also to funding for survivors of human trafficking. Simply put, for someone to start to benefit from all the different programs and support available to that individual, they simply need to be able to express to either law enforcement or a service provider that 3 things happened to them. That they experienced what we call the AMP model. So the A stands for an action, that individuals are either induced, recruited, harbored, transported, provided, or obtained. And again, to meet the federal definition, at least one of those things on that list had to have occurred to that person here in the United States. Now, if you do ever have an experience of working with a survivor of human trafficking, please don't be surprised that for a survivor, it's not going to be uncommon for them to experience several of those actions. Sometimes we've actually worked with clients that have experienced the whole list. But again, to meet the federal definition, at least one of those things needs to have occurred to that individual. The second part of the AMP model is the M. And that means either through force, fraud, or coercion, that person is engaging something against their free will. I'm going to go in depth a little bit more about each of these in a few minutes on the next slide, but I just want to acknowledge that I think for most individuals that are as familiar with the subject matter, that oftentimes we focus on the word force. That again, because of what we've seen in the news media or a really bad movie, there's this misconception that all survivors of human trafficking have experienced some sort of physical force, either being locked up in a cage like an animal or handcuffed to a bed. That does happen, but the tool that most perpetrators use against their victims, it's the tool of coercion. And again, I'll give you some more specific examples in the next slide. And then lastly, the P stands for purpose. That perpetrator is forcing that individual to engage in either sex for either money or some sort of financial gain, or the perpetrator is forcing that individual to work and benefit from that person's physical labor. So again, for a survivor to benefit and qualify for all the federal services they're entitled to, they need to be able to express that at least one of those things in each of those rows happened to them. Now, this morning I've noticed, as I usually have done, I've kind of interchanged some words, and I want to clarify my language this morning. And I want to acknowledge I'm probably not going to be a very good role model when it comes to the word victim. Because I've been in the field for so long, when I first entered into the domestic violence and sexual assault service area, we used to call people victims of those crimes. And we quickly learned that that word doesn't resonate, that the word victim really has a negative connotation to it, and that people, when they're called a victim, that doesn't resonate for them. So I personally believe that the word survivor is a better word to use, because what it does is it acknowledges to that individual that we believe them as a service provider of their experience, but we also acknowledge it doesn't define them as a human being as the word victim does. But because law enforcement and the criminal justice system, because they're using penal codes and laws, oftentimes in that arena, they still use the word victim. So it's still appropriate to use the word victim, but I would encourage all of you, is if you do come across an individual that has experienced human trafficking, that you choose to use the word survivor, even though I interchanged those two words this morning. In addition to that, the other part of the equation is the person that's committing the crime. I promised to stay professional this morning, and even though I have some more colorful language for people that exploit other individuals, we're going to call the person that's doing the exploitation a trafficker, a criminal, a bad person. So again, when it comes to human trafficking, there's two parts to the equation. The person that's being exploited, we'll call that person victim survivor, and then the person that's doing the exploitation, we'll call that person a criminal, a trafficker, a bad person. So that's the verbiage I'll be using this morning. As promised, I want to give some more specific examples about how our clients over the years have expressed to us the forms in which their perpetrators coerced, enforced, and frauded them into situations where they were exploited. Again, in our society, I think most of us think that survivors have physical force, that we as service providers should be looking for bruises or broken arms when engaging with a client or a customer that we're working with. And sometimes that does happen. But with physical force, please keep in mind that it can show itself in other ways too. For example, the use of forcing the individual to use substances like drugs and alcohol. And unfortunately, perpetrators will use whatever tools necessary to maintain that control over their victim. So sometimes some of our clients have expressed to us that their perpetrators force them to use drugs or alcohol to maintain that control over them. Also, another component of force is isolating the victim. And from my humble perspective of being in the domestic violence field for as long as I have, I see both a lot of intersections and similarities between domestic violence and human trafficking. And that isolation is really a powerful tool that perpetrators of human trafficking will use to maintain that power and control over the victim. Even if a survivor has a cell phone, oftentimes the perpetrator will limit their access. And so that person that's the victim of the crime won't have an ability to interact with friends and family members. So that really does increase the power and control that the perpetrator has over the person that they're exploiting. With fraud, especially for individuals that are here from another country without proper documentation, sometimes perpetrators of especially labor trafficking will falsify documents, so that allows that victim to be in the country and to work. But also too, when it comes to fraud, I think simply put, it's bait and switch. That oftentimes perpetrators will promise an individual a certain job at a certain rate. And then once that person starts that job, things change. That individual is not doing the job that they were promised, and they're not doing the work and being paid the rate that they were promised. And then when that individual speaks up and voices their concern, the perpetrator will threaten them, threaten to either physically harm them, harm their family, or have them deported. So again, a very classic bait and switch will happen, especially when it comes to labor trafficking. With coercion, I don't like to give perpetrators of this crime a lot of credit, but unfortunately, perpetrators are very intuitive, and they will pick out a weakness of an individual and use that weakness against that victim. And that weakness may simply be needing a job or to be able to support themselves. Whatever that perpetrator needs to say or do to maintain that power control, perpetrators will do. So it may be not allowing that person to have friends and family members. It could be to threaten to harm them or their family. It could be threatening to end a relationship, that there's some sort of consequence that's going to happen if a survivor voices their concern and threatens to leave that situation. And to keep in mind that when it comes to criminal behavior, that oftentimes in the past, especially law enforcement, would see individuals as a criminal, but really they are a victim of a crime. And luckily, as a society, there's kind of been a shift there that oftentimes perpetrators would get an individual to engage in some sort of criminal behavior and then force that person to continue in that behavior, threatening to turn them into law enforcement if they ever try to leave. So again, I don't like to give credit to perpetrators, but it's something that we need to keep in mind, that coercion is a very powerful tool that keeps victims in these situations that they're being exploited over long periods of time, sometimes weeks, months, years, and even decades. Because some of these different forms of control may be new to folks, I want to pause here to see if there's any questions either about the AMP model or about the forms that perpetrators may use to maintain that power and control over their victim. So if you do have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and speak up and ask. Okay, I'll take that silence as that we're all on the same page. I just want to stress that, again, in our society, unfortunately, there's this misconception that human trafficking is somehow happening to those people, that human trafficking can never be happening to a client that we're working with, or someone that we come across either in our professional life or in our personal life. And I want to dispel that myth, that potentially anybody can be a survivor of human trafficking. Unfortunately, like most crimes in our society, the most vulnerable and the most marginalized in our society oftentimes disproportionately are victims of human trafficking. But again, please keep in mind, anybody could be a victim of this crime. And that's why it's so important in various arenas that we screen for human trafficking, just as we screen for domestic violence and other crimes. To give you an example of the range in which people are being victimized, in our 7 years of working with survivors, we worked with a gentleman that was exploited in construction who was 73 years old. And fairly recently, we worked with a young girl that was 13 years old that was being exploited both sexually and in physical labor. And again, I think that's very reflective of what you see in the general population about this crime in our nation, that again, it's something that happens to both men and women. It happens to people that are born and raised here in the United States. It happens to people that are from a foreign country that are looking for a better life here in the United States. So again, please dispel any myth that you may have that this somehow is those people's problems, but it's potentially anybody that you come in contact with. Another misconception is out there is that labor trafficking isn't an issue or challenge here in the United States or around the world. And statistics and numbers are hard to come by because oftentimes when it comes to funding, most of the time the money is really spent on providing services. But there are some studies and statistics that are out there that estimate that globally speaking, labor trafficking is actually happening at a rate 3 times as great as sex trafficking. Now, I'm going to try to limit my personal opinion throughout the training today, but I just want to express that I personally believe one form of exploitation is not better or worse than the other. And luckily, the federal government agrees with me that all forms of human trafficking are against the law and that all survivors of human trafficking are entitled to support and to receive services. But I think over the years, for a variety of reasons, there's been more of a focus on sex trafficking. I personally believe that partly is because the word sex is in the word sex trafficking, so that gets people's attention. Also to the media and movies that we've seen have really focused on that. And then in a positive note, I think, especially the faith communities in the past, their hearts have been touched by people being exploited sexually. So the faith community historically has gotten more involved when it comes to sex trafficking. But please keep in mind that, again, both forms of exploitation are against the law. And more importantly, I'd just like you to be aware that labor trafficking is actually happening at a greater rate. So there's a need to be more vigilant, especially when it comes to labor trafficking. I do want to acknowledge that sex trafficking is occurring. And for the next couple of slides, I'd like to dive in a little bit and give you some information about where the different forms of exploitation are happening. What you see is a chart from the National Hotline, Human Trafficking Hotline, that receives calls from both community members and survivors. So this chart that they developed doesn't show us necessarily who called in, but what it does share with us is the venues in which the exploitation may be occurred. So as you can see, about 10% of the calls came in regarding things that were happening in local hotels and motels. About 10% of the calls were calls about concerns happening at massage and spas. So I want to see this morning who is going to be brave to unmute themselves. Why do you think individuals are picking up the phone and calling the hotline about spas in their communities? It's not to make an appointment. So why do you think community members are picking up the phone? Anybody want to take a educated guess?
Is it because of liability issues by the businesses? They don't want to gain a bad reputation for their industry?
Part of it is that you're spot on, that they're concerned that, and I appreciate you sharing that they're concerned that they don't want to be perceived to be doing things that are against the law. And also too, people are seeing businesses that are actually providing these services that are sexual in nature. Even here in Sacramento County recently, there was a massage parlor that was in business that unfortunately that employer had 3 employees that were providing massages, but also 2 were being forced to engage in sexual activities. And luckily, based on a tip, law enforcement was alerted to the situation and were able to remove those 3 individuals and actually hold that business owner accountable for what he did. And again, that's not unique to Sacramento County. That's something that's happening throughout the state of California and the nation. In addition to that, the online ads that are occurring, and as you may be aware, the great thing about technology brings you and I together today for this training, but unfortunately it does allow people that are wanting to purchase sex to buy sex. And that's happening with individuals as young as 18, 17, even 13, 14 years old. And even though historically the law enforcement and governmental agencies have cracked on it on different websites that provide that kind of service, it continues today. With the resident-based commercial sex, what's happening in various communities, our homes are being purchased. And instead of a family moving into that home, an individual will bring several folks to actually provide sexual services. So in the old days, what we used to call a brothel now is popping up in both very affluent communities and also into communities that are struggling economically. And then lastly, other venues, I interpret that to be that unfortunately survival sex is still happening in our society and folks are being forced to engage in sex for money. So I think it's important to be aware that sex trafficking does occur and it comes in many different forms. In addition to that, with labor trafficking, the hotline also tracked the different venues in which people were picking up the phone and calling the hotline to voice their concerns. The majority of the calls, as you can see, was about 19% regarding domestic work. And again, I want to see who's going to be the brave person this morning to give me what they think domestic work means in this context.
Usually it's people who are working in other people's homes. Oftentimes people will be from a foreign country and they will bring people from their own country in, promising them a new life in America and all the freedoms that are expected here, and get something totally different.
Totally insightful, spot on answer. I'm going to take this audience with me to every training I do. So domestic work, just to clarify and expand a little bit, is that it's work that we hire in to have people come in and provide a service in our household. So it could be a nanny, it could be a maid, it could be a cook, it could be a gardener. And I really appreciate your insightfulness as far as the connection between the person that's doing the exploitation and the victim of human trafficking. We'll discuss that dynamics a little bit more, but especially when it comes to domestic work, it's not uncommon for a family to be here and become successful and have children and become overwhelmed. And so they turn to an auntie or an uncle, maybe in their country of origin, and say, why don't you come live with us and take care of our kids, and we'll start the process of you becoming a US citizen too. But as one of your colleagues noted, what will happen is that uncle or auntie gets here, starts watching the kids, and then all of a sudden they're working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, they're not being paid, and oftentimes they're forced to live and sleep in the garage. And when that auntie or uncle voices their concern about the situation, their relatives will threaten to deport them or call ICE on them. So that's one example that we've seen with some of the clients that we've worked with. I'm personally a native Californian, and I'm really grateful that I have access to really great fruits and vegetables. But unfortunately, in our society, there are farmers that take advantage of their workers. And for some individuals, at the end of the month, when you and I would get a paycheck, a worker that's in the agricultural setting may go to their employer, instead of getting a paycheck, they're actually presented a bill that the farmer will charge them for taking them to and from the fields, charge them for the place that they were staying, often substandard. It could be a trailer that was designed for 6 people that person's living with 15 other people that doesn't have running water. And then also a farmer may have a small grocery store that he provides or she provides groceries for a fee to their employees. So again, instead of getting a paycheck, the farmer will actually turn around and say, oh, you owe me money. So again, what we used to call debt bondage that we thought decades ago was removed from our society continues to happen today. With traveling sales crew, one specific example that I can give you happened in the Northern California area, where a young couple back in Boston came across a job opportunity here in Northern California. And this 18 and 19-year-old couple, they didn't even have enough money to get here. But after talking to their potential employer, they went to their friends and family members, and they were able to buy a one-way ticket to Sacramento. And the future employer said, yeah, you'll make so much money, you'll love the job, but even if you don't, I'll give you a plane ticket back to Boston so you have nothing to lose. Well, that couple made it to Sacramento. That total stranger picked them up at the airport and drove them to a pretty good part of town, gave them some supplies, and said, I'll see you in 12 hours. Well, during that 12 hours, that couple went door to door trying to sell magazines. And after 12 hours of being not successful of even selling one magazine, luckily that couple met that same individual where he promised to be. And the couple decided that this was enough, and they expressed to that employer, thank you for this opportunity, but we're deciding to leave, so please give us that plane ticket back to Boston. The employer turned around and said, what are you talking about? Not only did I not promise you a plane ticket for Boston, but you owe me $200. I gave you $100.
They already
for
left,
the
so just I'll be.
Excuse me, if people could check to see if they're muted, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Bye.
Great, I'm hearing some folks in the background, thank you. And unfortunately, that person again threatened to have them arrested if they weren't paying him for those supplies. Luckily for this couple, they knew that that wasn't right. And that couple actually got connected with an agency in this region where they were able to stay safely for a couple days. And then eventually they were able to return to their family members back in Massachusetts. The reason I share that story, it's twofold. One is that I think, again, it gives a very specific example of that classic bait and switch that employers use on their victims, promising one thing and then changing the dynamics. But the other reason I'd like to share that story is that for that couple, luckily that exploitation only lasted one day. For a lot of survivors of labor trafficking, exploitation lasts months, years, and again, sometimes even decades, because they'll be threatened if they try to leave the situation, there's going to be some sort of consequence. Also, too, I want to share with you one of my first presentations I provided was actually in Vacaville at a local social service agency. And during my presentation, I was talking about this subject matter. And one of my audience members said, hey, Roger, did you hear about what happened at the Mexican restaurant last month? I hadn't. So this person shared with me that there was a restaurant in Vacaville that had been there for decades, that was a pillar in their community. But recently what was discovered was that that employer had both a cook and a dishwasher during the day, that person turned around and forced those two same employees to be security guards, in which that restaurant owner was not paying them for. And again, I think that's what makes this issue so challenging, is that human trafficking is happening in both large multi-billion-dollar corporations and small mom and pop stores and restaurants. It's happening in places that you and I go to, and we take advantage of the services that they provide. And when it comes to labor trafficking, we don't know how employers are treating their employees behind closed doors. Does that employee have the freedom to leave that situation if it's not a healthy and a productive work environment for them? And if that's the case, that's a form of human trafficking. And then lastly, as you can see, people called in about the health and beauty services. So with that, that's nail salons and beauty parlors. Again, because some of these different venues may be new to this audience, I want to pause again to see if there's any questions that have developed based on the presentation so far. Okay. Again, I want to stress this isn't a Northern California or Bay Area problem. This is both a state, national, and global problem. Again, with the hotline, what they did is they tracked the calls that came in. And as you can see from this map, the greater the color, the brighter that it is, the more calls that came in. What I don't want you to do is to think, well, you want to move to Nebraska or Wyoming or Nevada thinking that human trafficking isn't happening there. I can guarantee you that it is, but please keep in mind that the population in those states are less than California and other more populous states, and also to the awareness of services is not as great in those states as in California and Texas and Florida. But again, I can guarantee you that exploitation is happening in every state in the union and every community too. In California, luckily, a lot of folks are picking up the phone and connecting with the human trafficking hotline. And again, I see that as a positive, where some people may look at that as a negative. I think it's a positive thing that people are aware of this issue and they know that resources are available. In addition to that, our clients that we've worked with over the years primarily are from Mexico. And I think it's important that we look at this issue both nationally and then locally. With our clients over the last 7 years, about 50% of their clients, their country of origin was Mexico. And those individuals primarily were being exploited both in the construction industry, the restaurant industry, and then in agriculture. Now, again, that's not to say that someone's from Mexico can't be exploited in other industry. That's simply what our office here in Sacramento has seen over the last 7 years. With our clients that came from China, oftentimes those individuals were being exploited in the garment industry and they were being sex trafficked. And then lastly, for individuals that were from the Philippines, a large percentage of those individuals were being exploited in the healthcare settings, especially in long-term care facilities where an individual was helping individuals that had experienced some medical condition where they're not in the hospital, but yet it wasn't safe for them to go back home. There was some sort of assisted care facility, and unfortunately their employees were taking advantage of them. But again, I just wanted to stress that again, it doesn't matter a person's country of origin, that really what's happening is that people are being exploited from many different countries and in many different areas and service providers within our various communities. So now that we have kind of a basic understanding of what human trafficking is, what I'd like to do is provide you all some tools to potentially identify someone that may either currently be a victim of this crime or is a survivor of human trafficking. Before I do that, though, I want to take a little bit of time and a little bit of energy of thinking about traffickers. And for just a moment, I'd like you to think about what is that connection between the person that's being exploited and the person that's doing the exploitation. So who are traffickers? Not necessarily their physical appearance, but again, the connection between the two. For most folks, they think it's a stranger, that it's an individual that's driving around in a van near a park, sees a young person, opens the van door, pulls them in the van, and then drives away with them and starts exploiting them. And luckily, that doesn't happen very often. Again, with the media and movies, I think oftentimes that's the connection that most people think. But really what we've seen by working with our clients over the years, there's a deeper connection. One of the trends that we've seen recently is the use of organized crime members exploiting individuals. For example, there is an individual that we've worked with recently who I'll call George, grew up in Mexico. And unfortunately, his path came across a cartel. And what that cartel did is every day, George had to go to a specific location where he received a backpack, which he was never allowed to open. Whoops. And also, too, he was given an address. And George was told, if you don't get back in time, either you or one of your family members will be killed. And unfortunately, George had to deal with that fear for several months of not knowing if either he or his family members would be alive that next day. Luckily for George, he did survive that 3 months of torture, and he was able to actually relocate himself and his family to California. And luckily, there was an attorney that was working with George and his family, was able to identify what George had experienced as human trafficking and actually got him connected to our services. So we were able to provide him the support for his healing process to begin. In addition to that, there is that connection of employers exploiting individuals, but oftentimes there's a deeper connection between the trafficker and the person being exploited. With our clients, oftentimes it's boyfriends and girlfriends that are doing the exploitation, especially young couples that are out on the street and may be homeless. A couple that maybe doesn't even have enough money to stay the night in a motel. So one person will turn to the other and say, well, I love you so much. Why don't you go and sell yourself sexually tonight so we can, sleep on a bed and get a hot shower? And because it is a relationship, one person agrees to do that. Well, a week or two may pass, and instead of being asked to provide sex for money, that person is told, if you don't engage for sex for money, there's either going to be some sort of physical consequence to that person or a threat of ending that relationship. It also happens with spouses or family members. As we talked about earlier, especially in the domestic setting, it's not uncommon for aunties and uncles to be exploited. Or luckily, we've provided trainings in the foster parent system that, unfortunately, from the state of California, we give youth to foster families expecting those foster children to be in a safe environment, but family members or foster families sometimes turn around and exploit those youth. And another similarity that I see with domestic violence, where you have individuals that grew up in abusive situations, unfortunately, they grow up and repeat that cycle of violence. That's also true with human trafficking, that unfortunately past victims of this crime, they grow up and sometimes they become perpetrators themselves. Again, I want to pause to see if there's any clarifying questions about traffickers. Okay, so things to look for with indicators. I think it's challenging because in our society, there's a lot of reasons why someone might be acting very fearful or anxious. It could be domestic violence, it could be a host of other things, but please keep in mind, it might be that that person is being exploited. And if you have a client that you're working with and they're constantly checking their cell phone, which is probably common for a lot of individuals, but especially if they're very concerned that if they don't respond back in timely manner, something bad's going to happen, or if they don't respond to their employer, that there's going to be some major consequences. Also, too, in the place that you're working, if you have some sort of intake process, if this is a social service agency or a medical facility, I strongly encourage individuals to do that intake process with a person by themselves. Just like we would screen for domestic violence, it's true with human trafficking. It wouldn't be a safe place if you had an individual that had their perpetrator with him in the same room. So it's really important that we allow that person to speak with us on an individual basis alone. Also, too, if you have someone that is not able to come and go as they please, and this is true of both adults and youth, that even as a youth, someone that's 16, 17 years old, even though there may be a curfew at home, hopefully all individuals have that ability to have a social life and to flourish as an individual. And if you come across someone that doesn't have that freedom, that could be a potential red flag and a reason to ask them further questions. Also, to someone that is being transported to and from work. Or if you're working with a person over a period of time, that you're hearing their stories of experiences of either their work environment or the relationship, and you hear and learn of some inconsistencies, that might be an indicator that they are currently being victimized of this crime. And again, I would ask you to ask some follow-up questions to help you better identify what's going on in a person's life. Because what we found with working with our clients over the years is that when we provide an individual a safe place to disclose to us what's going on, we learn oftentimes that that person has been exploited by working really long hours. And I'm sure today's age that all of us work some long days and some long hours, but when we work long days, we're compensated, that our employers follow state and federal laws. Human trafficking perpetrators, they don't care about the laws. So unfortunately, our clients have expressed working again 6-7 days a week, 10-12 hours a day. Also the conditions in which they're working and are living. And that might be challenging, especially if you are working or coming in contact with someone from another country, that the standard of living may be a little bit better than maybe their country of origin. But again, there are standards that we say that employers must provide to their employees that are not being met. And then lastly, too, the use of different forms of identification, either a work visa or a student visa, or even a driver's license, that oftentimes perpetrators will take those documents and control them. So that way that maintains that power and control over that person that they're exploiting. Some questions to ask, and I think hopefully today I challenge you not necessarily to get caught up on the exact verbiage of the question, but that you ask questions to elicit a response from the individuals that you're working with. And do it in a non-judgmental way, and have that interaction with everyone, that you don't make an assumption that just because someone identifies as female or you're working with a client from another country, that only those people should be asked these questions. I hope you make it a practice of asking screening questions from everyone. And if time is limited, I think we could even pare down this list to 3 simple questions. The first question I would ask is the top of the list, and that is someone forcing you to work or have sex against your will? I think that's a really great question to ask. Another question I would encourage you to ask is, have you lost your freedom to come and go as you please? And again, this is true of both adults and youth. And then lastly, I would encourage you to ask, is someone threatening to hurt you or your family? Several years ago, this question was more specific, that we would focus on and ask an individual, is someone threatening to hurt you? But again, the trend that we are seeing is that perpetrators are threatening not only to harm a victim of human trafficking, but potentially that person's loved one, that person's parents, that person's children. So I would strongly encourage all of you to broaden that question and ask, again, is somebody threatened to harm you or someone you love? And again, it may be challenging to ask these questions, and it may seem to be very intrusive, but by simply posing these questions in a non-threatening way, it gives space to an individual to choose to respond. And sometimes, I think oftentimes in our society, especially with service providers, there may be this concern that if I ask these questions, I'm going to be inundated with responses that everyone is going to disclose to me that they're a victim of human trafficking. Please keep in mind that's not the case. For a lot of different reasons, someone may not respond and identify with your question and give you the response to help you know what's going on, but they may choose to, especially building that trust and rapport over time will allow someone to feel safe to disclose to you what's going on. For example, I provided a training up in Eureka at a domestic violence and sexual assault center, and that center disclosed to me that they had been working with a survivor of domestic violence for nearly 10 years before that individual felt comfortable enough to disclose that they were also a victim of human trafficking. And there are a lot of reasons why a survivor may not feel comfortable disclosing. But again, if we as providers provide a safe environment for them and ask questions in a non-threatening way, eventually that survivor may feel comfortable enough to disclose to us what's actually going on in their life. And if you yourself or your agency needs additional support in either developing forums or asking questions, that is a free service our agency can provide in helping you develop ways in which to ask these questions of the clients that you come in contact with. Another component to human trafficking, I think, unfortunately in our society, is that we still blame victims of this crime. I think especially for any of us of privilege, it's easy for us to turn around and say, well, if I didn't like that job or if I didn't like that relationship, I would leave. So it should be the same for everybody else. And I think, again, there's a lot of similarities with domestic violence that when I first started working in the field of domestic violence, we used to, as a society, blame victims too. We would say, well, why does he or she stay in that relationship? If my significant other ever abused me, I would leave, so they must like it. Luckily, as a society, you know that we've shifted from that we don't blame victims of domestic violence, but we hold perpetrators accountable for that crime. As a society, we're not quite there with human trafficking, but I think we still blame victims of human trafficking. So I think it's really important to understand why people may be in these situations over a long period of time. Again, it's because of that isolation and that constant supervision that perpetrator has over that victim. Also, too, especially of youth or individuals that are from another country, they don't know what their rights are. They don't know that they're entitled to breaks and to lunches and to leave a job if they don't want to engage in that work anymore. And sadly, there's been a chilling effect over the last few years that I've heard from both our clients and from the district attorney's office, that there is this distrust of law enforcement. And unfortunately, it's based on either because of that person's experience in their country of origin, or by people that were born and raised here in the United States, either their own experience, negative experiences of law enforcement, or of their community's experience. And unfortunately, perpetrators will oftentimes tell victims that if you ever try to reach out for help or to get assistance, you're going to be forced to work with law enforcement and that you're going to be deported, which is a straight out lie, that survivors of human trafficking are not going to be forced to work with law enforcement, but there is that fear. Also, too, what really surprises a lot of individuals when it comes to human trafficking is that survivors may express that they want their situation to change, but they're concerned about what's going to happen to the person that's exploiting them. That trauma bonding that develops over a period of time. And also, too, we need to keep in mind that oftentimes there is that connection, either biological, through DNA, or an emotional connection that that victim has with their perpetrator. So it's going to be very common for someone to express to you that they want their situation to change, they want the abuse to stop, but they're concerned that something bad is going to happen to the person that was exploiting them. And that's really natural and normal to happen. The major factor that keeps survivors in these situations where they're being exploited over long periods of time, it's the use of fear. And again, so much information and garbage is given to that victim over a period of time that they start to believe it. And so the fear of deportation, the fear of physical harm to either themselves or their family, the fear of simply not knowing what will happen next if that person leaves that situation. So again, the use of fear is a very powerful tool that really keeps that individual in a place where they are able to be exploited over a long period of time. And it takes a lot of courageous energy for that person to overcome that fear, to express to you or to another agency what they've experienced. Some myths that are out there that I wanted to dispel before we talk about services that are available is that number one is that the crossing of a border is not a part of the equation. Again, unfortunately, a lot of individuals, even professionals, get smuggling confused with human trafficking. And again, reflecting back on the A&P model, please remember crossing a state or national border is not a requirement. So you could have someone that was born and raised in Contra Costa, born and raised in San Joaquin or Humboldt County. They may have never left that county. They still could meet the qualification of being a survivor of human trafficking. So please don't think crossing a state or national border is a requirement. Another myth that hopefully I've already dispelled this morning is that some sort of physical restraint is necessary. And again, the individuals that you may come across, the tool that most perpetrators will use, it's the tool of coercion. So if someone has not been physically beat up or handcuffed or locked in a cage, that doesn't mean that they're not a survivor of human trafficking. Another myth that is out there is that people in the social service field think that a survivor will come up to them and say, "Help me, I'm a victim of human trafficking." In my 26 years of working in the social service field, I personally haven't, any of my colleagues that I've worked with, or any of the many conferences that I've attended, have I yet to hear that the first words out of a survivor's mouth is, "Help me, I'm a victim of human trafficking." Usually what you will hear is someone expressing concerns either about an abusive partner that's forcing them to engage in sex for money, or their boss forcing them to work in a job that they don't want to work in anymore, but they feel trapped and they know they can't leave. That's how an individual will express to you what's going on. And hopefully, in return, you can do three things. Number one is acknowledge that. And number two is express your concern. And the third thing you could do is educate them. By that, I mean, I'm sorry that's happening to you. And that sounds like a really bad situation. based on what you've shared with me, that sounds like human trafficking. And did you know that as a survivor of human trafficking, there are programs that are available to you? So again, acknowledging a person's situation and letting them know that the proper terminology for what they're experiencing and that there are resources available is something that's available to all of us as professionals if we do come across someone that discloses their experiences to us. Another myth that's out there is that human trafficking is only happening in underground industries, like in gangs or the selling of drugs or the selling of firearms. And again, based on our clients' experiences, human trafficking is happening in multi-billion-dollar corporations and mom and pop operations. With number 5, there is this myth that, well, people get what they deserve. If someone comes here from another country without proper documentation, they kind of get what they expect. Well, luckily, even though I think that's not very ethical, that all of us deserve to be free of being exploited, luckily the federal government and state governments agrees with me that, again, all of us, if we find ourselves in a job where it's not a good fit, we all have the right to terminate that job. And again, it doesn't matter what our country of origin is, and it doesn't matter our documentation status. All of us are not entitled to be exploited by another human being. And then lastly, that only folks from other countries can be exploited disproportionately. Again, the most marginalized in our society are more likely to be victims of human trafficking. But again, everybody potentially can be a victim of this crime. It doesn't matter if someone is foreign born or if they were born here in the United States. So that said, I'd like to shift gears and focus on something positive. I'd like to focus on assistance programs that are available, again, to both survivors of human trafficking and to you as professionals. The HOPE program has been providing services in 31 counties for the last 7 years. And when I first started working in the HOPE program 5 years ago, we had one case manager providing services. And to be very transparent, the majority of our clients and people that we work with are primarily from Sacramento, Yolo, Placer, and Contra Costa counties. The more rural counties, we don't provide as many services directly because we don't have a case manager embedded in those counties. But luckily, as of hopefully next month, we're going to have a case manager that will be working in Eureka to provide services to the more rural counties. But we provide services in the 31 counties that are highlighted. So if you come across someone that you think or suspect may benefit from our services, that lives or works in one of those counties, we can provide services. If, though, you come across someone that's in the gray highlighted area, even though we may not be able to provide services to them directly, luckily there are agencies and programs similar to the HOPE program that we can give that warm handoff to them. But again, our service area is all the way from Contra Costa County all the way up to the Oregon border. And we really focus on 3 kind of important areas with our clients. The first is the legal challenges our clients face, the physical well-being, and lastly, the mental well-health. Our case managers, once we're connected to a client, we do 3 things. We do a risk assessment, we do a safety assessment, and then we start the process of our clients working with us to develop 3 goals. Those goals vary from individual to individual, and it really isn't up to us as case managers to tell what that survivor needs to do. Because again, with human trafficking, individuals have been told historically what they have to do. We really believe that survivors are capable of making decisions that are best for them and their lives. So for the goal setting, it may be simply knowing what their options are. For some survivors, it's starting the process of getting a restraining order against their perpetrator. For one client recently, it was relocating with their son back to Austin, Texas. And as you can suspect, that at the beginning, it's very crisis-oriented work, that it's a lot of text messages and phone calls. It's checking in almost hourly on the client. And then over time, as that person's life stabilizes and they're in a healthy, safe environment, then it's checking in maybe weekly and then monthly, and then hopefully they were closing out that person's case. We are federally funded through the Office of Victims of Crime, through the Department of Homeland Security, and that entitles and allows us to work with our clients up to 2 years. What I think is really impressive, though, is that the average length of time that we work with our clients right now is around 10 to 11 months. I think that reflects two things. One, just how great our case managers are, but more importantly, I think it really reflects the resiliency of survivors of human trafficking. Unfortunately, I think there's this misconception that people that are victims of this crime are broken individuals that are not capable. That's not the case. That even though individuals may have experienced really horrific situations, once we give survivors a safe environment, give them a little bit of support and encouragement, individuals can thrive. And we've actually seen that time and time again. We don't operate a safe house. Again, because historically we've been a refugee resettlement program, we have connections with housing programs throughout various communities. So we're able to find long-term housing. Sometimes it's a single family home, sometimes it's apartments, and based on the community in which we're working in, sometimes it's shared living environments with a roommate. But again, even though it's challenging to find long-term housing, we're able to do that for the clients we work with. We have a very limited food and clothing storage facility and program, largely based on some of our donors, but we also work with other food and clothing closet programs to provide that long-term assistance for our clients. And then lastly, once a person is at a safe environment and has stability in their life, what we try to do is set that person up for success. So an individual may choose to brush up on their English skills, or maybe it's getting it connected to a training program. For example, two individuals that come to mind to me that we've had the privilege of working with, one was a 19-year-old individual that had been exploited, both sex and labor trafficked. She had her high school diploma. And our case manager, Christina, literally drove that person to the local Contra Costa Community College, stood in line with her until she reached the front of the line and registered for her nursing classes. And again, that's the level of service that we provide. Now, I don't want to disparage any other agency or program, but for some programs, it's simply a referral process. And that's not the way that we operate, that we really are able to transport and provide that hand-holding process to help people navigate systems. Also, though, I want to be transparent that we don't do the work for our clients, that doing all the work for our clients we feel is a disservice. So it's finding that balance of empowerment and helping them navigate systems, but also too having them do part of the work so that when they are no longer our clients, they are going to be set up for success. And not only are we educating our clients, but also too, we have the privilege of sometimes educating our community partners that, especially in some of the more rural counties in which we provide services, you may have a county worker that's never worked with a survivor of human trafficking, and looking at this form for the first time may seem strange to them. So not only are case managers educating our clients, but we're also educating our partners and making sure that individuals are receiving the services that they're entitled to. Because our philosophy and our case management system may be different and new to folks, I want to pause again to see if there's any questions about the services that we provide our clients. Okay. I think it's also important, especially if you come across an individual that is here with that documentation, that that individual is told that they have options and choices. One of the options that they have is to start the process of applying for either a T or a U visa. A T visa is a special kind of visa for individuals that are victims of human trafficking. And a U visa is a special kind of visa for individuals that are victims of crimes here in the United States. And it's important to let folks know that this is an option that they have. Now, please keep in mind some important facts. One fact is that because someone is here with that documentation isn't currently a US citizen, they may not want to become a US citizen, and that's a very valid choice. Another thing that they need to keep in mind is that if they choose to start this process, is that they are going to be agreeing to work with law enforcement in the court system in a criminal case. And I can tell you, simply put, that these cases can last many years, anywhere from 3 to 5 years easily. And that's a major commitment, and that may be a commitment that a survivor is not willing or wanting to take on. And again, that's a very valid option for that person. But if they do want to start the process of becoming a US citizen and potentially their immediate family, it's really important that they are connected with the immigration attorney. It's not simply filling out a form and turning it in, is that form needs to be completed correctly and completely, and the process needs to be adhered to. And if they don't do that, that individual probably may be deported. So it's really important that A, individuals that are here with that documentation know that this is an option, and B, that they are given the resources to make that option successful if they decide to take that path. The other component to keep in mind is that all individuals, doesn't matter if they're foreign born or born here in the United States, are entitled to cash assistance. So again, to help with housing, to help with their medical needs, and with their food. And for some survivors of human trafficking, it's not uncommon for a survivor to have never seen a dentist or not to have been allowed to see a doctor for the last 10 years. So for their physical well-being, it's really important that we connect them with those services. And again, that's true for both foreign-born survivors and individuals that were born here in the United States. Our team, we're small but mighty. We are growing. When I first got hired 5 years ago, we were a team of 3, and now we've grown to a team of over 5. So Galina is our supervisor that comes with a background of working in the district attorney's office. As you can see, I do the training and outreach component. And if you ever were to pick up the phone and wanted to talk to one of our case managers, or if you ever were to refer a client, I think it's important to see the faces of the folks that people are going to be engaging with. So one of our case managers is Nikita. She is bilingual and she works with adults. Yasmin, I'm exceedingly jealous of her because not only does she work with survivors of human trafficking directly, but she can do that in 3 different languages. She speaks both Arabic, she speaks Spanish, and English. And then lastly, Vanessa is one of our newest members of a little over a year. Not only is she our case manager lead, but also too, she's the individual that works with youth. Vanessa brings over 20 years of working in social service fields in the San Joaquin Valley of working with youth. So if you ever were to refer a client that is a minor, Vanessa would be the person that that individual would be working with. Or if you had a question about working with a youth, you're not sure what services are available, or you need additional information, Vanessa, that hip individual with the blue hair, would be the person that you would be talking to. I want to provide some service information, and again want to stress that our services are not only for survivors of human trafficking, but also for community partners. The way that we connect with our clients, it can be either through a raid, and again, we've historically had a really good working relationship with the district attorney's office and law enforcement in Contra Costa specifically. And in the past, we've been invited to raids, and then once that perpetrator was safely taken away, we started providing services to that survivor. In addition to that, we also do get referrals from community partners, and where you might be at your office and then have a disclosure and want to connect an individual with us, you can simply pick up the phone and contact us and pass that phone to that survivor. Or you can simply give that person our phone number, and that person, when they think it's safe and comfortable to do so, they can reach out on their own accord. So the barriers for us to start working with clients are very low. It's either, again, through law enforcement or referral from an agency like you, or a self-referral. In addition to that, if you want to send us a referral or ask a question via email, we are accessible that way. Currently, please keep in mind that we are not a 24/7 operation. Where other agencies and programs are available at 3 o'clock in the morning, our case managers actually get to sleep. But I realize that maybe some of the programs that you operate in, that you don't have that luxury, that you may come across an individual at 3 o'clock in the morning and you may need those services. So I'd like you to know that the national hotline number is also another great resource that you can contact. And I've actually reached out to them myself, and in the materials that were provided to you through this training, that contact information is available both through their phone number, and there's a number that you can text. The last thing I'd like to put out to this group this morning is, again, a huge thank you. I acknowledge that this is not an easy subject matter. And again, it may feel a little bit overwhelming that you're learning information about yet another need in your community. And you may feel overwhelmed like, great, Raj, now I need to look for human trafficking victims. Well, I can let you know that you are coming in contact with individuals already that are victims of this crime. And hopefully now, by attending this training, you have better resources to both identify survivors and to know that there are resources are available to you. So again, if you're meeting with someone and you're not sure what steps to take or what signs to look for, please feel free to reach out to us. There is no such thing as a bad or stupid question. And again, our office and our case workers are available Monday through Friday from 9 o'clock to 5. And again, if it's after hours, you can still leave a message or consider calling the human trafficking hotline that can connect you with services too. And then lastly, I just want to thank you all for the opportunity to provide this information and let you know that these trainings are available to other community partners. So if you found value in this training today and think that your agency or program could benefit from a similar training, or maybe you're part of a faith community, or maybe you're currently going to school and you would like a free training for that organization or group, I would love to have a discussion to make that a possibility. And again, the trainings I provide are absolutely no cost and can range from as short as an hour to as long as a half-day training. And again, I love the opportunity to engage and really provide information that is impactful to both our communities and service providers. So this morning, I tried to have 3 goals that hopefully I reached. One was to give a very basic understanding of what human trafficking is and to give information and statistics. And if this information sparks interest in you, I really encourage you to find information either through our website or through the national hotline number and another organization that provides great amount of detail and statistics and a lot of helpful information is called the Polaris Project. Simply Googling in the word Polaris and human trafficking will pop up their website. And I encourage you, if this is something you want to get more information about, please consider finding that information at Polaris Project. And then also too, I provided information about how to identify survivors. And then lastly, hopefully all of you are taking away knowing that there are resources available to both survivors of human trafficking and for you as a professional, that if you ever needed to reach out to us, that the IRC and the HOPE program is a resource to help you as you provide services in your community. Again, I want to pause one last time to see if there's any questions about any of the information that I provided this morning.
If you can see the chat, Roger, there are a few questions for you
Oh.
there.
Thank you. I did not do that. Thank you. Appreciate it. Let me pull that up. Recording. Yes. Great. I see that question. Great. If you are interested in the slides, I can send those to you. So please contact me directly. I, generally speaking, don't get them out to the general audience, but if you would like a copy of the slides, please email me directly and I can make that possible. The hotline number should be a part of the handouts that I provided. And if you're interested in that, please look at your handouts, and that is available. Also, simply typing in national hotline number or human trafficking hotline number will make that information available to you also. And let me see if there's any other questions. Oh, great question about when someone calls the hotline, what kind of services can they expect to receive? The hotline itself is not a service provider, but a clearinghouse. So what they will do is provide information regarding resources that are appropriate. So generally speaking, what will happen is, what I've done is I've called or texted, and the first question is, they want to know, are you a service provider or are you a private individual? And then they'll ask a couple questions about the situation. And then what they will do is they will provide resources that are appropriate. So they'll discover what county that you're in, and then they will connect that caller to services in that specific county. So again, it's not a service agency that provides services directly to clients, but it connects individuals to services in various counties throughout the United States. And that might be very helpful. Again, if you're working with someone that's from another county or maybe relocating to another state, the national hotline number can connect those individuals to those services. Any other questions? Again, please feel free to unmute or type in the chat box. A great question. In the chat box, it says, what kind of things can we see to encourage people to call when identified as possibly being human trafficking survivors? And that's a great question because it's really challenging. I think, especially as service providers, generally speaking, we want to fix and help people as quickly as possible. I think the first thing I would encourage folks to do is simply to acknowledge that person's experience and to believe them, and to, again, let them know what's happening to them isn't right and is a crime, and to let them know that they have resources. And I think the hardest thing for service providers really respect is that it's going to be on that survivor's term. Just like with domestic violence, we may want to have that feeling of getting that person out of that abusive relationship on our timeline. That's really true with survivors of human trafficking too, that for some survivors, it's just knowing what options and choices that they have. And it may not be safe for them to talk to a service provider right now, that it may be weeks or months before that person feels that it's safe for them to engage with services that are available to them. And I think that's really challenging for us as individuals that, again, we want this situation to change right away. But if we force things, really what we may do is put that person in more danger and in more jeopardy. And we really need to respect that that survivor knows what's best for them. And by simply providing them resources and information, they will follow up on a timeline that is appropriate for them. It may not be our timeline as a service person or as a caring human being, but again, we need to respect that individuals will connect with services when it's safe for them to do so. And also what we can do is respect those choices. Again, as we have interactions, we don't want to belittle or make that person think that they need to do things to please us, that really they're making decisions and choices that's right for them on the timeline is what they're needing and not what makes us happy or makes us feel better. Really good question. And sometimes that's challenging. And also to get that support. If you are working with someone, or in the future, if you're working with someone, please feel free to reach out to our case managers and to get that additional support and guidance that can help you as a service provider, because sometimes it can feel very overwhelming and you may feel very lost or not sure what to say or do. Please feel free to reach out to our case managers and we can provide you that additional support to give you the encouragement that you may need as you work with that individual. Great question.
Roger, just one additional comment on that. Really well said. Thank you so much. That the Polaris text line is they're available for people because a lot of times making a call is quite dangerous to someone who's in that situation, and the texting might be easier. So that's another resource that's there for people.
Spot on. Great. And I appreciate it. That's the other thing too with all of the audience today. I would never want any of you to be in jeopardy and danger. And that is a real part of this challenge too, is that anytime that professionals or individuals engage with a survivor, because that really does put that victim in danger and potentially even you as a caring person in danger too, because if that perpetrator ever finds out that that individual may be leaving that situation, just like with domestic violence, that period of time when someone is leaving, it can be a potentially dangerous time. So please make sure that you're taking safety precautions for yourself and make sure that the person that you're working with really engages with all the different means that they have to increase their safety too. So again, safety is one of our priorities, not only for our clients, but for our partners and our caseworkers as they navigate the different stages as a person connects with services. And again, the national hotline number, both the phone number and the text numbers, are great resources that people can follow up on in a safe manner. And again, just thank you all for being here with me today. In return, please know that I'm a resource. So later today, if you didn't have an opportunity or didn't feel comfortable asking a question, my direct phone number is available there. My email address is there. Please feel free to follow up with me later today, next week, or next month. Also, too, as a reward, I would love some feedback. Of the handouts that I passed along to the Resource Center was an evaluation form. There's a pre and post test. If you, over the course of the next couple days, would fill out that, and also, too, there is a place for feedback. For the last 5 years, I've looked at every single feedback form that I received, and I really do value your opinion. So if, again, over the course of the next few